Alabama is often introduced through its geography. A Gulf shoreline, a river city, a steel town, a rocket center. Yet the more revealing map is historical, a sequence of turning points that connect the coast to the uplands, the plantation belt to the factory floor, and the courthouse square to the launch pad. A best-of itinerary, recast as history rather than sightseeing, becomes a guided argument about how the United States was made and remade in one state. Through conquest and forced labor, industrial ambition and violent backlash, religious ferment and political reinvention, war and migration, protest and technological daring. Begin at the Gulf, not as a beach but as a frontier. Long before Alabama was Alabama, the northern Gulf Coast was a contested world of indigenous nations, European empires, and maritime trade. Spanish explorers entered the region in the 16th century, but it was the French who established the most enduring early colonial footprint along this coast. In 1702, they founded Fort Louis de la Louisiane at what became Mobile, making it one of the earliest European settlements on the Gulf of Mexico, and, for a time, the capital of French Louisiana. That fact alone unsettles the usual story that the American South begins with English colonies. Along the Mobile River and the Bay, French officials negotiated alliances and rivalries with powerful native polities, especially the Creek Confederacy, and built an economy that mixed military strategy with commerce, slavery, and diplomacy. The coastal world also reminds us that slavery in Alabama did not begin with cotton. Enslaved Africans were present under French and later British rule, and the region's early economy depended on coerced labor in multiple forms. After the 7 Years' War, Britain took control of Mobile in 1763. Spain seized it during the American Revolution in 1780. And only in 1813 did the United States capture Mobile in the War of 1812 era. Sovereignty changed hands repeatedly, but the logic of empire remained. Control the waterways, control the trade, control the people. Then came the wars that opened Alabama to an American plantation revolution. The Creek War of 1813 to 1814, part of the wider War of 1812, ended with Andrew Jackson and allied native forces defeating the Red Stick faction at Horseshoe Bend. The Treaty of Fort Jackson forced the Creek to cede vast lands, including territory taken not only from Red Stick opponents but also from Creek allies. This land seizure accelerated settlement and cleared the path for Alabama statehood in 1819. Within a generation, cotton and slavery would dominate the state's political economy, binding Alabama to global textile markets and to a domestic trade that moved enslaved people in chains from the Upper South into the Cotton Kingdom. That transformation is not abstract. It is measurable in human movement and human suffering. Alabama became one of the principal destinations of the forced migration known as the Second Middle Passage. Families were sold southward. Towns and plantations grew around auction blocks and credit systems that treated people as collateral. By 1860, enslaved people constituted nearly half of Alabama's population. The Black Belt, named for its dark, fertile soil, became a landscape where wealth accumulated for some through the extraction of labor from others, and where black communities, despite terror and legal suppression, built kinship networks, spiritual life, and traditions of resistance that would outlast slavery itself. Mobile, in this era, carried another layer of complexity. It was a port city with cosmopolitan ties, and it became a conduit for the cotton economy. It also holds one of the most striking, lesser-known stories of American slavery's illegal persistence. The Clotilda, the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to the United States, arrived near Mobile in 1860, decades after the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed. Survivors later founded Africatown, preserving language and memory under extraordinary pressure. Their descendants' efforts to protect and interpret that heritage have become a modern reckoning with what was long denied or hidden. The Civil War brought Alabama to the center of Confederate politics. In January 1861, delegates met in Montgomery and voted for secession. A month later, Montgomery became the first capital of the Confederate States of America. The symbolism mattered. This was a state declaring that slavery was not merely a regional practice, but a political principle worth disunion. Yet the war also revealed Alabama's internal fractures between planters and non-slave-holding farmers, between Confederate nationalism and local survival, between the rhetoric of honor and the reality of scarcity. Union blockades strangled coastal commerce. Battles and raids disrupted interior counties. When the Confederacy collapsed, emancipation arrived amid devastation and uncertainty. Reconstruction briefly opened political space for black citizenship and office holding, supported by federal authority and by black organizing in churches and mutual aid societies. That period also provoked a violent counter-revolution. Paramilitary groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, used terror to restore white supremacy. Over time, Alabama's lawmakers and elites erected a legal architecture: poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and racial terror enforced by lynching that hollowed out the promises of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 1901 Alabama Constitution was designed explicitly to entrench disenfranchisement, and its legacy still shapes governance debates today. While political rights were being strangled, a different kind of revolution was rising from the ground: industrial Alabama. Birmingham, founded in 1871 at the intersection of iron ore, coal, and limestone, became a symbol of the New South vision. Industrial growth meant to replace the plantation economy. Steel mills and railroads transformed the landscape and drew waves of workers, including black Alabamians leaving rural labor regimes and immigrants seeking industrial wages. Yet this industrial promise carried its own brutal systems. Alabama became notorious for convict leasing, a practice that effectively re-enslaved thousands, disproportionately black men, through arrests and fines that fed labor to mines and factories. Conditions were lethal. The state profited, while private operators extracted labor with minimal oversight. It is one of the clearest examples of how emancipation could be undercut by law, economics, and violence working in concert. The early 20th century brought modernization, but also deep contradictions. Mobile's shipyards and port activity tied Alabama to global conflict and commerce. Birmingham's labor movement fought for safer conditions and fair wages, colliding with corporate power and racial division. Across the state, the Great Migration carried black Alabamians to northern and western cities, exporting Alabama's labor and culture while also creating new political pressure from afar. Meanwhile, Jim Crow remained firm at home, enforced not only by statutes but by everyday rituals of humiliation and the threat of retaliation. Then, in the mid-20th century, Alabama became a proving ground for American democracy. The modern civil rights movement did not erupt suddenly. It grew from decades of organizing: teachers, ministers, veterans, domestic workers, students, who built networks and strategies under surveillance and intimidation. Birmingham emerged as a focal point because it was both symbol and battleground, a city of industrial might and rigid segregation, where law enforcement under Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor met nonviolent protest with dogs and fire hoses in 1963. Images from Birmingham traveled the world, exposing the violence required to maintain segregation. That same year, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church killed 4 girls: Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, turning a place of worship into a crime scene and a national indictment. The movement's momentum pressed forward into 1965, when voting rights became the central fight. Alabama's voter suppression was not subtle, it was systematic. The campaign that culminated in the Selma to Montgomery marches, often remembered for Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, forced the nation to confront the gap between constitutional ideals and lived reality. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was not a gift. It was extracted through disciplined protest, strategic litigation, and the willingness of ordinary people to face extraordinary danger. Yet Alabama's story is not only a chronicle of oppression and resistance, it is also a story of scientific ambition, one that complicates easy regional stereotypes. Huntsville, in the Tennessee Valley, became central to American rocketry and the space race. After World War II, the U.S. government brought German engineers to America under Operation Paperclip, including Werner von Braun. Their expertise, shaped by wartime Germany and morally shadowed by the use of forced labor in Nazi weapons production, was redirected into U.S. military and space programs. In Huntsville, von Braun's team helped develop the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. The legacy is double-edged. Technological achievement intertwined with ethical compromise, and a reminder that Cold War urgency often absorbed uncomfortable histories rather than resolving them. This technological pivot also reshaped Alabama's economy and identity. Federal investment in defense and aerospace created new educational pipelines and a professional class linking Alabama's future to research, engineering, and global competition. It also created a different kind of migration: scientists, engineers, and military families, adding layers to the state's demographic and cultural life. Across these chapters, Gulf Coast empires, plantation expansion, Civil War politics, industrial labor regimes, civil rights insurgency, and space-age transformation, one theme persists. Alabama repeatedly sits at the hinge between American ideals and American practices. The state's history shows how power is built through land and law, how wealth can depend on coercion, and how democracy requires constant defense against those who would narrow it. The modern relevance is not confined to memory. Debates over voting access, labor rights, education, and historical interpretation still echo Alabama's earlier struggles. The rediscovery and study of the Clotilda has intensified conversations about reparative justice and public history. The ongoing reassessment of convict leasing and prison labor connects past exploitation to present systems. And the legacy of the Voting Rights Act remains contested in courts and legislatures, especially after key federal protections were weakened in the 21st century. A road trip through Alabama's highlights, translated into historical terms, becomes a journey through the architecture of the United States itself: how a nation expanded, how it justified bondage, how it industrialized, how it fought over citizenship, and how it reached for the moon while still arguing over the meaning of equality on Earth. Alabama's past is not a regional sidebar. It is a central chapter in the American narrative, written in ports and courthouses, in mills and churches, in laboratories and launch complexes, each one a reminder that history is not behind us, but around us, shaping what is possible next.